Jenny Millers was 29 years old, a waitress at Rosie's Diner, a small establishment tucked between a hardware store and a laundromat in rural Kansas. Her life followed the same routine each day: wake before dawn, walk 3 blocks to work, tie her faded blue apron around her waist, and greet the morning regulars with a smile that never revealed the loneliness hidden behind it. She lived alone in a 1-bedroom apartment above the pharmacy, her only family reduced to a few photographs yellowed by time. Her father had passed away when she was just 15. Late autumn in Nebraska carried a distinct kind of cold, a dry, silvery gray chill that seeped quietly into every crack, into every breath. Emily Carter wrapped her scarf tightly around her neck, her steps steady along the frost-laden cobblestone street. 3 blocks, a 12-minute walk, and there it was, a small diner called Sonny's Diner, nestled between a rusted auto repair shop and an aging laundromat. She pushed open the diner's door with her frozen fingers, and the bell above chimed its familiar note, slipping quietly into her chest like a habit worn smooth over time. Inside, the diner remained unchanged: the scent of roasted coffee, the soft crackle of the kitchen, the warm yellow glow spilling onto the worn wooden walls. Emily shrugged off her coat, tied a faded green apron around her waist, and hid everything behind a smile as gentle as a whisper. "Good morning, Emily," called George, the retired mailman, tipping his cap to her from the bar. "Good morning, Uncle George," Emily replied, her voice clear as a still lake. No one knew that behind every smile, Emily lived an empty life. A tiny apartment above the pharmacy, faded family photos, and the sparse occasional calls from an aging aunt in Florida, what remained of something once called family. Each morning, she poured coffee for regulars, served breakfast plates, wiped down counters, and repeated a play with no audience. Sometimes she wondered if anyone truly saw her, a 27-year-old waitress, with no one waiting at home, no one asking how her day had been. But Emily had grown used to it. She had learned how to disappear into the bustling world with small gestures, a nod, a smile, a "have a nice day" spoken like a song long memorized. And then, on a timid Tuesday morning in early October, when sunlight was still hesitant behind streaks of gray cloud, he appeared. He sat down at table 9, the table tucked far into the left corner, where few people ever chose to sit. A battered, oversized backpack rested beside him, worn as if it had traveled through countless summers. He said nothing, just opened a book, spreading it across the table like an invisible shield. Emily noticed him instantly, the way he hunched his shoulders, making himself as small as possible, his gaze drifting aimlessly as if ready to bolt at any moment. "Hi there," she approached, her voice gentle, not too eager. "What would you like today?" The boy looked up, gray-brown eyes gleaming with the kind of guardedness that only those who had been deprived understood. "Just water," he said softly, as if even speaking cost him more than he could afford. Emily smiled a smile as soft as morning mist and turned away to fetch a glass. When she placed the water with a paper straw in front of him, he simply nodded, a gesture so small it was almost swallowed by the air. No food, no further requests, no conversation, just that gaze, laden with a quiet sorrow, like a curtain never drawn back. The second day, he returned. The third day, the same. The fourth day, again. Every morning at 7:15, he appeared like a shadow, claimed his hidden corner, opened his book, ordered a glass of water, sat silently for 40 minutes, and then slipped away before the distant school bell rang. Emily found herself waiting for him, though she couldn't quite explain why. Perhaps because in his thin, hunched figure, she saw herself from 10 years ago, someone who had once tried to shrink herself so no one would notice, someone who had once believed that silence was the safest way to survive. Lying awake at night, Emily found herself wondering, where had the boy come from? Why was he alone? Why only water? But each morning as she opened the diner, cleaned the glasses, and prepared breakfast, she quietly reminded herself, don't ask, just welcome. Gently. The 5th day, the 6th, and the following week, the boy kept coming. Not a minute late. Not a different seat. Not a single change in his routine. The old wall clock ticked away like a metronome, and every morning, just as the hour hand nudged past 7, Emily would glance toward the door, and there he would be, slipping in quietly like an autumn breeze through a crack in the window. She began to notice the small details about him, the way he always chose a seat facing the window, but with his back against the wall, as if needing to watch every exit, the way he opened his book but rarely read, his eyes instead quietly sweeping the room, scanning every face, every movement, the way he sipped his water so slowly, as if trying to stretch his time in this safe harbor just a little longer. There was something strangely grown up about those small gestures, a caution far beyond what should belong to a 9-year-old child. One morning, with a fine drizzle falling outside, the diner was sparsely filled with a few scattered customers. Emily walked past the boy's table, quietly placing down the glass of water as usual. Their eyes met for a fleeting second, just a heartbeat, and then he quickly dropped his gaze back to the open book. But this time, Emily caught something real within his glance, a hunger not only for the stomach, but for safety. That night, in her small apartment, thick with the scent of dampness, Emily tossed and turned in bed. Thoughts swirled inside her head like a flock of lost birds. What should I do? If I ask, would he run away? If I stay silent, am I doing enough? Finally, she told herself, no one needs questions when they're just trying to survive. They only need to know someone sees them. The next morning, just as dawn was breaking, Emily arrived earlier than usual. She quickly tied on her apron, nodded to George and Kathy at the kitchen counter, and headed straight into the kitchen, where the oven's warmth still lingered. On the prep table, a plate of leftover pancakes had been set aside, an extra dish no one seemed to want. The thought struck Emily like a flash. Without hesitation, she took the plate, dusted it lightly with powdered sugar, and placed a small packet of butter beside it. 7:15. The door opened once again, and the little bell above chimed. The boy stepped inside, dragging his oversized backpack lightly across the wooden floor. Emily waited until he was settled at his usual spot, then walked over with a plate in hand. "Hi there," she smiled, trying to keep her voice casual. "Well, the kitchen made too much today. It would be a shame to waste it. I figured you wouldn't say no, right?" The boy looked up at her, suspicion and confusion mingling in his eyes. His small shoulders tensed, clearly caught between fear and hunger. "It's okay," Emily added softly, almost as if she were speaking to herself. "Better to eat it than let it go to waste, right?" Without waiting for a reply, she placed the plate down and hurried back to the counter, her heart pounding as though she had committed some great mistake. From behind the misty coffee station window, Emily watched discreetly. The boy sat still for a moment, his hands gripping the edge of the table tightly. Then, very slowly, very cautiously, he reached for the fork. The first bite disappeared quickly, swift and almost desperate. As if afraid someone might snatch it away, Emily turned away, hiding a bittersweet smile. 10 minutes later, when she returned to clear the table, the plate was spotless, save for a thin smear of syrup. The boy pretended to be engrossed in his book, but Emily noticed how tightly his fingers clutched the page as if struggling to hold back something powerful. "Thank you," the boy whispered, his voice hoarse as she picked up the empty plate. Just 2 simple words. But in that moment, Emily knew she had touched something incredibly fragile and profoundly precious. The next morning, when the kitchen once again accidentally made an extra portion of eggs and toast, Emily already knew exactly who that plate was meant for. Every morning, Sonny's Diner continued to open its doors under the warm yellow lights, welcoming the weary and the worn with its frayed leather booths. But now, something had quietly shifted. A small, secret rhythm had taken root in the far corner of the diner, an accidentally made extra plate of food, a boy who silently finished every bite, and a woman who watched quietly from afar. A silent ritual, an unspoken covenant. Emily never asked the boy his name, never demanded explanations, never judged. Each morning, as naturally as breathing, she placed a fresh, hot meal in front of him, then walked away as if nothing had happened. But not everyone remained silent as she did. One morning, as Emily was refilling George's coffee, the old man lifted his cup, cleared his throat, and asked, "Who's that, Emily?" "That boy. Never seen anyone drop him off." Do you know who he is? Emily froze for a half second, the coffee pot tipping slightly, and a few drops splashing onto the saucer. She forced a faint smile. I'm not sure either. I just know he's hungry. George nodded thoughtfully, but his eyes lingered toward table 9 where the boy hunched low over his plate. The whispers began to spread, like embers smoldering beneath dry leaves. A strange kid, always sitting alone. No parents, no guardians. Must be hiding from something. Emily heard it all. She didn't respond, nor did she bother to argue. The murmurs were like a distant wind rattling old walls, something she had long grown used to. Still, that fragile peace shattered one colder than usual morning when Megan, the head cook, pulled Emily aside behind the counter, where the air still smelled faintly of grease. Megan crossed her arms over her chest, her voice practical and blunt. You're feeding a stray cat, Emily. Emily blinked. A stray cat. Keep feeding it like this, it'll get used to it. Then one day, it'll disappear without a glance back. Megan's tone wasn't cruel. It was simply the fatigue of someone who had seen too much disappointment. I just don't want to see you get hurt, Megan added, softening her voice. Sometimes, kindness needs boundaries too. Emily lowered her gaze, her hands knotting the hem of her apron. Doubt, cold and sharp, pricked at the edges of her heart. Am I being foolish? Am I just fooling myself with a pretty story? She glanced through the crack in the kitchen door. In the far corner, the boy sat eating, hunched over, shrinking into himself as if apologizing to the world for existing. Emily took a deep breath, lifted her head, and said firmly, It's okay. I used to be that hungry too. Megan's brow furrowed in surprise. In 3 years of working together, it was the first time Emily had ever shared something personal, a short sentence, but heavy as lead. A confession without fanfare, without tears. That night, alone in her tiny, musty apartment, Emily pulled out an old wooden box from beside her bed. Inside were faded family photographs, a yellowing Christmas card from her aunt, and a crumpled letter from her father. She ran her fingers over a picture of her father, in uniform, smiling kindly under the harsh desert sun. Closing her eyes, she whispered, I once knew what it meant to be hungry, not just the kind of hunger that gnaws at your stomach, but the kind that gnaws at your heart. The next morning, as the familiar door swung open at 7:15 and the boy stepped in, Emily was ready. Inside her, there was no longer any hesitation, only a quiet resolve, like a small lamp, steadfast against a storm. Winter crept slowly over Nebraska, bringing with it knife-edged winds and an endless, overcast sky. Inside Sonny's diner, thin films of frost clung to the windows, blurring the dim shapes of the street beyond. The air felt heavier than usual that morning, as if the whole world was holding its breath for something unnamed. 7:15 a.m. Emily stood behind the counter, her hands busy with the cups, but her eyes fixed firmly on the door. Normally by now the little bell above the door would chime softly, and the boy would slip inside quiet, cautious, like a wisp of wind. But this morning, there was no chime. No small figure appears, only the wind whistling through unseen cracks, cold and empty. Emily shifted on her feet. 1 minute, 5 minutes, 10 minutes. She told herself, maybe he's just late today. Maybe school is closed. Maybe it's just something small. But as the minutes ticked by, worry seeped into her like the cold through too thin clothes. 8:00 a.m. Regulars began to trickle in laughter and greetings filling the diner, but table 9 remained empty, the little chair untouched and cold. Emily bit her lip, quietly prepared a hot plate of pancakes, and placed it carefully on the familiar table. The plate steamed, the sweet scent of syrup curling into the air. She stepped back, standing at a distance, waiting, but the empty chair simply sat there, answering her with silence. George passed by the counter, lifting his coffee cup and glancing toward the empty table before clearing his throat. The kid not coming today. Emily just nodded, saying nothing. Nearby, Megan bustled past with a tray of dishes, tossing a half-joking, half-serious comment over her shoulder. Maybe he found a better breakfast somewhere else. The offhand remark landed in Emily's heart like a stone sinking into deep, dark water. All day, the pancake plate cooled, hardened, then grew cold. Even when the diner closed and chairs were stacked on tables, the untouched plate remained like a solitary, discordant note. Emily wrapped the leftover food in foil carefully and took it home to her small apartment. She couldn't bring herself to throw it away. "If he comes back tomorrow," she whispered to herself, "at least I'll have something ready." The next morning, Emily arrived at the diner even earlier. She brewed coffee, wiped down the tables, and kept glancing toward the door. 7:15, 7:20, 7:30. No one came in. Emily prepared another fresh breakfast plate and placed it on table 9. Once again, the empty chair answered her with only cold, biting silence. The third day, the fourth, the fifth, the chair remained empty. The pancake plates grew cold, and inside Emily, an emptiness slowly expanded with each passing day. On the 6th day, Kathy, another waitress, patted Emily on the shoulder as she passed table 9. "You knew, Emily." Kathy sighed without malice. "Strays, they never stay." Emily didn't respond. She only tightened her grip on the hem of her apron, bowing her head to hide the shine of tears in her eyes. That night, alone in her tiny apartment, Emily unwrapped the foil covering the cold pancake from days earlier. She didn't eat it. She simply sat there, her hand lightly brushing the hardened surface, as if trying to touch something fragile and fading. "Maybe Kathy's right," she thought bitterly, heart aching. "Maybe I'm just a fool, dreaming soft dreams in a hard world." But then, from deep within her heart, a small, stubborn voice whispered, "No, even if only once, even if only for a fleeting moment." He had a place to sit quietly, to be seen as a human being, and that was enough. Emily closed her eyes, letting the first tear slip quietly down her cheek. A nameless loss, a love that asked for nothing in return. On the 10th morning without the boy's presence, Nebraska's skies hung heavy and cold like ashes. Emily tied her apron, poured herself a cup of strong black coffee, and quietly placed a fresh plate of pancakes on table 9 like a silent ritual that only she still believed in. The regulars drifted through, some stealing glances at the empty table, then quickly looking away with a mixture of pity and discomfort. Near noon, Kathy came rushing into the kitchen, shaking her head. "Emily, you should see this," she said, holding out her phone. On the screen was a Facebook post from the Nebraska Springs community page. Emily squinted at it. There, in a blurry photo, was table 9 with its untouched plate of pancakes. The caption, cruel and mocking, read, "Sonny's Diner, now serving ghosts. Poor souls still believing in miracles in this practical world." Hundreds of likes. Hundreds of comments, sharp, judging, heartless, probably just a marketing stunt, cheap pity tactics, teaching kids that playing the victim gets you free food. Emily felt as if someone had thrown a bucket of ice water over her, not just from the cruel words, but from the brutal truth staring back at her. Kindness, when it didn't fit people's tastes, would be mocked without mercy. That afternoon, as Emily wiped down the counter, George, perched on his usual stool, shook his head. "Don't let them break you, Emily," he said. "Some people forget. They once needed help, too." Emily offered him a thin smile but said nothing. "It's not that I'm broken, Uncle George," she murmured eventually. "It's just. I didn't realize silence could be condemned, too." That night, alone in her dimly lit apartment, Emily pulled out the old wooden box again. Her hands trembling slightly, she opened it. Inside were the same familiar keepsakes: a photo of her father in his desert fatigues, a crumpled Christmas card, a worn letter. She found a particular page, one she had read so many times before, day 213. "Today the first shared half my rations with a local boy. Johnson said I was crazy. Maybe he's right." But the look in that boy's eyes, it was the same look I had at 8 years old, when my mother snuck me the last piece of bread. When you're hungry, you don't need lectures. You need bread. We never grow poorer by sharing, but those who forget how to share become impoverished in their hearts forever. Emily read it again and again, each word sinking deeper, bitter and sweet all at once. In her mind, she heard her father's voice, steady, warm, You don't need to know someone's story to know they need help. Sometimes, all it takes is a meal, a gentle glance, a small pocket of peace in the storm. Suddenly, tears streamed freely down Emily's cheeks, but this time, they weren't tears of doubt or defeat. They were tears of release, letting go of the need for understanding, letting go of the need for recognition. She wiped her face, stood up, and carefully closed the journal, as if sealing away a precious treasure. In the mirror, the reflection staring back was still the same, a 27-year-old girl with a frayed apron, messy hair, and dark circles under tired eyes, but also a woman who knew she would not back down. The next morning, Nebraska Springs was colder still, the wind rattling the dry branches outside. Emily opened the diner earlier than usual, cleaned table 9 meticulously, and prepared a hot plate of pancakes along with a warm glass of milk. She placed them on the table, and for the first time in many days, she smiled. Not because she believed the boy would return, not because she hoped someone would notice, but because she had finally understood something simple. Sometimes, doing a kind thing is enough, even if no one sees, even if no one remembers. At the far end of the diner, the old clock ticked steadily. Outside, the snow fell silently, blanketing the town in a soft, indifferent white, and at one small table, a plate of pancakes and a glass of milk waited patiently, like a quiet faith that somewhere in the cold, lonely world, kindness still mattered. Just because. Sometimes kindness needs no audience. On the 23rd morning without the boy, Nebraska Springs felt as frigid as a forgotten city. The sky churned a heavy shade of lead, and the wind swept through the empty streets, carrying glittering dustings of snow. 7:15 a.m. Table 9 remained empty. As she had every morning, Emily prepared a fresh, hot plate of pancakes and a warm glass of milk, placing them neatly on the table, no longer out of hope, simply because it was what she had chosen to do. 9:17 a.m. The doorbell did not ring, but this time, something unusual stirred the air inside the diner. The lively hum of conversation abruptly died down. Emily lifted her head from behind the coffee station, her brows knitting together. Every face in the diner had turned toward the large front window. She followed their gaze. Outside, in the small parking lot before the diner, 4 black SUVs gleamed under the muted winter sun, pulling into a park in a half-circle formation. Their doors opened in unison, and men in crisp military uniforms stepped out solemn, composed. The man in front was tall, his army dress uniform heavy with glinting medals across his chest. His face was weathered, deeply lined with hardship, and his eyes were sharp and unflinching gaze born of having witnessed too much loss. The air inside the diner thickened, impossible to breathe. Customers left their breakfasts half-eaten. Coffee cups trembled slightly in unsteady hands. Even Megan, behind the kitchen counter, instinctively lowered the flame on the grill. Boots struck the frozen ground in a steady cadence, echoing like war drums. Ding, the small doorbell finally chimed. 3 uniformed men stepped inside. No one dared move. Mark, the diner's owner, scrambled out from the back office, hunching his shoulders as he forced a stiff smile. "Good morning, gentlemen. How can we help you?" The lead officer removed his cap, revealing a close-cropped silver head. His voice, low and steady, cut through the silence. "We're looking for someone." Mark swallowed visibly. "Who, sir?" "Emily Carter," the man replied, his gaze scanning the diner before landing firmly on the small woman standing frozen behind the coffee station. Emily didn't move. Her hands, accustomed to serving hundreds of breakfasts, gripped the coffee pot so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Every eye in the room shifted toward her. One skipped heartbeat, one suspended breath. Slowly, she set the coffee pot down, wiped her hands on her apron, and stepped out from behind the counter, her movements feeling almost surreal. Her voice, dry but unwavering, carried across the room. "I'm Emily Carter." The officer advanced, his boots heavy on the cold tile, each step weighted with gravity. Standing before her, he reached into his jacket and withdrew a sealed envelope bearing an official stamp. "I'm Colonel Robert Hastings, United States Special Forces," he said, his voice measured but heavy. He extended the envelope toward her, his next words dropping like hammers into the charged air. "We are here today because of a fallen soldier's last request." Emily blinked, feeling the ground tilt beneath her. The envelope rested heavily in her palm, not just paper, but the weight of a future about to shift irrevocably. Colonel Hastings locked eyes with her. Solemn, respectful. "A soldier has fallen." Before he left, he made sure to leave instructions. In his final letter, he wrote, the colonel paused, withdrawing a worn, crumpled sheet of paper from his breast pocket. His voice grew rough as he read, "If I don't make it home, please find the woman at the little diner. The one who fed my son each day, without a single question, the one who gave Noah quiet dignity on the loneliest days. Tell her she didn't just feed a hungry boy. She preserved the soul of a soldier's child in a world that had forgotten him." Emily's knees weakened. She clutched the envelope against her chest. The only solid thing in a spinning world. Colonel Hastings straightened. Then, in a single, sudden motion, he brought his hand sharply to his brow in a full military salute, a sacred gesture, reserved for the most honorable of deeds. Without hesitation, the soldiers accompanying him followed, their salutes crisp and silent. The entire diner stood frozen. No whispers, no clinking dishes, only the sound of beating hearts, loud, stunned, reverent. Emily, the small, invisible waitress in a worn apron, stood there trembling under 1,000 unsaid words. I just didn't want him to be hungry," Emily whispered, almost to herself. Colonel Hastings allowed himself a rare, soft smile, a sunbeam in a blizzard. Sometimes feeding a hungry child is the greatest act of heroism in the darkest of days. No one applauded, no one cheered, because somehow everyone understood. At that moment, no celebration could match the quiet enormity of simple human kindness. And then, as if by silent agreement, every patron in the diner rose to their feet. George, the gruff old man, who always sat by the window, Megan, the weary, sharp-tongued cook, Kathy, the timid young waitress. One by one, they stood. They bowed their heads. Not a word was spoken, just a deep, solemn bow, an apology, a thank you, an unspoken acknowledgement. They had been wrong. Emily stood there, surrounded by a golden haze of weak morning light, clutching the crumpled letter of a soldier she had never met, and for the first time in so many years, she did not feel alone.